Picture this for a moment. The glow of hot metal, the rhythmic clang of a hammer striking anvil, sparks dancing like fireflies in the dim light of a forge. It's a scene that feels both ancient and alive, a craft that has shaped human destiny in ways we often overlook. But have you ever stopped to wonder, where did it all begin? How did the first blacksmith discover that by heating and hammering metal, they could transform raw ore into tools, weapons, and artifacts that would change the world forever? This isn't just a question about history. It's a mystery that lies at the very heart of civilization itself. Think about it: without blacksmithing, there would be no iron plows to till the soil and feed growing populations, no sturdy swords to defend kingdoms or expand empires, no nails to build the ships that explored uncharted oceans. From the humblest farming implements to the most magnificent architectural wonders, the blacksmith's trade laid the foundation for human progress. It empowered armies, built cities, and fueled innovations that pushed society forward century after century. Yet, for something so fundamental, its origins are shrouded in fire, mystery, and fragments of forgotten stories waiting to be pieced together. That's exactly what we're going to do today: unravel one of history's most fascinating puzzles. We're diving deep into the ancient beginnings of blacksmithing, tracing its footsteps back through time to understand how this essential trade emerged. Along the way, we'll uncover tales of ingenuity, explore groundbreaking techniques, and meet the visionary minds who harnessed fire and metal to shape our world. So join me on this journey into the flames of the past, where every strike of the hammer echoes with the spirit of human innovation. You're about to discover how blacksmiths didn't just start a trade, they ignited the spark of civilization itself. Long before the first proper forge was ever built, humanity's relationship with metal began not with a bang, but with a curious sizzle. Imagine an ancient campsite, perhaps 10,000 years ago. The fire has burned down to embers, and amongst the ashes, someone notices a few peculiar heavy stones that look different from the rest. They're cooler to the touch, perhaps with a strange greenish tint. These weren't just rocks. This was malachite, a copper-rich ore. As the heat intensified through the night, something miraculous happened. The stone didn't just get hot, it began to weep. Tiny beads of a shiny red-gold substance pooled in the fire. The next morning, after the fire had cooled, our ancestors would have discovered these mysterious, solidified droplets. They were dense, they were bright, and they were utterly fascinating. This was likely humanity's first accidental foray into metallurgy, a process we now call smelting. But even before that, there were other, even more ready-made sources of metal. In many regions, particularly around the Great Lakes in North America and in the Middle East, pure, native copper could simply be found lying on the ground in lumps. This was metal in its most accessible form, requiring no complex furnace to extract it from rock. It was a gift from the earth, waiting to be picked up. And then there were the gifts from the heavens and meteoric iron. Occasionally, a blazing streak would cross the sky and crash into the earth. These fallen stars were composed of an iron-nickel alloy, a material far stronger and sharper than anything Stone Age cultures had ever held. To them, this metal from the sky must have seemed like a divine substance, possessing mystical properties. It was also incredibly rare and precious, often reserved for ceremonial objects for the most elite members of a society. So what did these first experimenters, these proto-smiths, do with these mysterious materials? They did what humans have always done: they tinkered. They likely took a heavy stone and began to pound a lump of cold native copper. They would have quickly discovered it was malleable. It could be flattened and shaped without shattering like flint or obsidian. If they held it in the embers of a fire first, they found it became even softer, even more workable. This process, known as cold working and then annealing, was the absolute foundation of all metalworking. They were learning the most crucial lesson: fire transforms metal. These individuals weren't blacksmiths as we know them. They were potters, tool makers, hunters, or shamans, curious people who stumbled upon a new possibility. With patience and a hammerstone, they could slowly fashion a native copper bead, a simple awl for piercing leather, or a small, rudimentary knife. Each successful creation, no matter how small, was a monumental leap. It was proof that the very substance of the world could be altered and improved by human hands, fire, and ingenuity. They were playing with the building blocks of civilization, completely unaware that their campfire experiments were the first, faint sparks of an industrial revolution that would reshape the entire world. This shift from a nomadic lifestyle to settled farming was arguably the single most important precondition for the birth of blacksmithing. For the first time, communities were putting down roots, literally and figuratively. They were clearing land, tilling soil, and planting crops, all incredibly demanding tasks that wore through stone and wooden tools at an alarming rate. A flint hoe blade might last a season before it chipped and shattered. A digging stick reinforced with a sharpened stone point would splinter and break under the strain of tough, unforgiving earth. There was a growing, tangible need for something stronger, something more durable, something that could be repaired instead of simply replaced. This necessity became the mother of invention. The relentless demand for better, more efficient farming equipment created a powerful incentive to look beyond the limitations of stone. Imagine a farmer, frustrated after his third shattered adze of the season, eyeing a peculiar, heavy green stone he'd seen near the riverbank. He might recall how other stones seemed to sweat that strange, shiny substance in the campfire. A spark of connection would ignite. What if that shiny, malleable stuff could be shaped into the blade of a plow? What if it could be pounded into a tip that wouldn't snap off inside the hard ground? The desire to solve a very practical, everyday problem is what drove the earliest metallurgical experiments from curious pastime to essential craft. But innovation requires more than just a good idea. It requires time. And time is a luxury that hunter-gatherers, constantly on the move in search of food, simply did not have. The agricultural revolution changed that equation entirely. For the first time, a successful harvest could produce a surplus. This surplus was civilization's first savings account, a store of calories that meant not every single member of the community had to be directly involved in food production every single day. This surplus created something revolutionary: free time and the possibility of specialization. This allowed for a brand new type of person to emerge in these early villages, the full-time, dedicated artisan. Freed from the dawn to dusk struggle of hunting or harvesting, certain individuals could now focus their entire energy on mastering a specific skill. Perhaps it was the potter who discovered how to achieve hotter, more controlled fires in his kiln. Maybe it was the skilled flint knapper, whose intimate understanding of fracturing stone gave him the patience to experiment with fracturing metal. These individuals became the world's first professional craftsmen. They were no longer just dabbling with copper by the campfire after a meal. They were dedicating their lives to understanding its secrets. They began to amass knowledge, tools, and techniques, passing them down to apprentices, slowly transforming a haphazard discovery into a repeatable, improvable trade. The age of the specialist had begun, and it was this specialization that would eventually forge the first true blacksmith from the flames of necessity and opportunity. Out of that long period of tinkering and discovery, a true technological revolution was simmering, waiting for the right conditions to boil over. This eruption of innovation is what we now call the Chalcolithic period, or more simply, the Copper Age, spanning from around 4,500 to 3,300 before the Common Era. This was the moment humanity truly learned to command fire, not just for warmth or cooking, but as a transformative tool to unlock the secrets held inside stone itself. The key breakthrough was the move from simply hammering found metal to deliberately creating it through the controlled process of smelting. The discovery likely unfolded through careful observation. Early potters, masters of their kilns, were probably the first to truly crack the code. They would have noticed that when certain greenish or bluish stones, ores like malachite and azurite, were placed in their exceptionally hot, charcoal-fueled kilns, a remarkable transformation occurred. As the temperature climbed past 1,084 degrees Celsius, a critical threshold was crossed. The stone didn't just get hot, it underwent a chemical divorce. The unwanted rocky material, the gangue, stayed behind as a slag, while the coveted copper, now liberated, melted into a shimmering, liquid pool at the bottom of the furnace. This was alchemy in its purest, most primal form. They were turning green rock into glowing liquid metal. Once they had this molten copper, the next logical step was to find a way to shape it. They began to pour the dazzling, orange liquid into simple molds they had carved from stone or baked from clay. This process, known as casting, was a monumental leap forward. Instead of spending hours painstakingly hammering a single small all into shape, a smith could now pour molten metal into a mold and produce a perfect, detailed object in a single step. It allowed for the creation of more complex forms, like axes with sleek, sharp edges and socketed holes ready to receive a wooden handle. We know this wasn't just a happy accident that happened in one place, because the archaeological evidence paints a picture of a widespread revolution. One of the most profound examples comes from the Vinča culture, a highly advanced society that thrived in the Balkans. At a site in modern-day Serbia known as Belovod, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary, evidence of copper smelting that has been definitively dated to before 5000 before the Common Era. That's over 7,000 years ago. They found slags, fragments of crucibles, and even copper tools that testify to a sophisticated, organized understanding of this new technology. The artifacts they left behind are breathtaking. These weren't crude, experimental lumps of metal. They were elegant, purposeful tools, sharp chisels, robust axes, and finely made needles. This tells us that by this point, the knowledge had moved beyond mere discovery into the realm of a standardized craft. Someone in that village wasn't just a farmer who dabbled in metal. They were undoubtedly a specialist, a dedicated metallurgist whose valued skill was producing these coveted objects for the entire community. The Copper Age had officially begun, setting the stage for an even greater metallurgical revolution that was just on the horizon. And so, with the foundational knowledge of copper casting firmly in hand, these early metallurgists found themselves at the center of a social transformation every bit as profound as the technological one. As the first great urban centers began to rise from the river valleys of Mesopotamia and the plains of the Indus, the blacksmith's forge evolved from a simple workshop into nothing less than the engine room of civilization itself. In cities like Mohenjo-Daro, and Uruk, the rhythmic hammering of metal was the sound of progress, a constant backdrop to the creation of empires. The smith's primary duty, of course, was utilitarian. They produced the essential tools that made complex urban life possible. Strong copper and bronze saws cut the timber for buildings and ships. Durable adzes and chisels shaped the stone for monuments and temples. Most importantly, they forged the hardened plow tips and sharp sickles that increased agricultural yield, feeding the dense populations of these new cities and fueling their growth. Without these metal tools, the scale of construction and agriculture required by urban society would have been utterly impossible. The smith was quite literally building the world, one hammer strike at a time. But their role extended far beyond mere practicality. The unique ability to transform dull rock into gleaming, precious metal placed the smith in a category all their own, blurring the lines between craftsman, alchemist, and magician. This perceived command over the elements made them indispensable to the ruling class. Kings and priests quickly realized that metal could be used to create something even more powerful than tools: symbols. They commissioned smiths to produce breathtaking objects whose purpose was not to work the earth, but to command respect and signify divine authority. A simple spearhead was a tool for a hunter. A bronze spearhead inlaid with gold and electrum, featuring a finely crafted scene of a king slaying lions, was a proclamation of power, a ceremonial object meant for display in the palace. This is where we see the true blossoming of the smith's art into a form of high culture. They crafted elaborate jewelry for the elite diadems, necklaces, and earrings that shimmered with gold and precious stones, visually distinguishing the aristocracy from the common people. They sculpted religious artifacts from metal, intricate statues of deities, ceremonial vessels for temple offerings, and ornate standards that were carried in processions. Perhaps most tellingly, they produced weapons of such exquisite craftsmanship and expensive material that they were clearly never intended for the battlefield. These were objects of diplomacy, gifts between kings, or items buried with rulers to signify their status in the afterlife. The smith, in essence, became the graphic designer of the ancient world, creating the logos and branding that reinforced the entire social hierarchy. This led to an inevitable and crucial development. The control of metal resources became the ultimate source of political and military power. Rulers understood that whoever controlled the mines, the trade routes for tin and copper, and the craftsmen themselves, held the keys to the kingdom. As a result, the finest smiths were almost never free agents working in a village market. They were highly valued assets, often brought directly under the control of the palace or the temple, working in state-sponsored workshops. They received protection, raw materials, and a high status, but in return, their output belonged to the ruler. This system of royal patronage ensured that the most advanced technology and the most impressive symbolic objects served to consolidate the power of the state. The forge had become a strategic asset, and the blacksmith, once a solitary experimenter by a campfire, was now a key player in the court, their fire stoked by the ambitions of kings. Yet for all its beauty and versatility, copper had its limits. It was relatively soft, it could bend under stress, and its edges would dull quickly. The demands of growing empires and their armies called for something stronger, something sharper, something truly revolutionary. That breakthrough arrived not with the discovery of a new metal, but with a stunning act of alchemical combination, the creation of bronze. Some unsung genius, perhaps in a workshop in ancient Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, made a fateful experiment. Instead of pouring pure copper into a mold, they tossed a different kind of rocky material into the molten metal. When the mixture cooled and was hammered, the result was nothing short of miraculous. The new material was harder, far more durable, and could hold a lethal edge almost as sharp as obsidian, but without being brittle. They had invented an alloy. By adding a small percentage of tin to copper, typically around 10%, they created a material that was greater than the sum of its parts. This was a quantum leap in material science, and it launched the world headlong into the Bronze Age. This new technology, however, came with an immense and complicated challenge. Copper deposits were common enough, but tin was astonishingly rare. The two metals almost never naturally occurred side by side. This meant that a thriving bronze industry in Mesopotamia, for example, was entirely dependent on a constant, fragile supply chain stretching for thousands of miles. Tin had to be sourced from incredibly distant and difficult places, likely from as far away as Cornwall in Britain, Afghanistan, or Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. This necessity gave birth to the world's first long-distance trade networks. Adventurous merchants now braved treacherous mountain passes and sailed unpredictable seas, their ships and caravans laden with ingots of this precious, dull gray metal. The prosperity of entire kingdoms now hinged on the safe arrival of these shipments. A disruption in the tin trade could literally leave an army defenseless, unable to forge new swords or spearheads. The blacksmith's forge had suddenly become the endpoint of a globalized economy, connecting the known world through a relentless hunger for superior metal. Mastering the alloy was only half the battle. The next great challenge was shaping it into the complex forms that civilization demanded. This led to one of the most beautiful and ingenious technical processes ever devised, lost wax casting. This method allowed smiths to move beyond simple tools and create true works of art with breathtaking complexity. The process began with an artist sculpting an original model of the desired object, a detailed statue of a god, an elaborate piece of jewelry, or a sword hilt decorated with animals, but they sculpted it entirely out of beeswax. This wax model was then carefully covered in a thick layer of clay, forming a mold but with two critical tubes attached. Once the clay was fired in a kiln, the incredible happened. The wax inside melted completely and drained out through one of the tubes, leaving behind a perfect, hollow negative space within the hardened clay. This is where the name lost wax comes from the original wax model was sacrificed. Then, the molten bronze was poured in, filling every intricate crevice left by the vanished wax. After the metal cooled and solidified, the clay mold was broken away with a hammer, revealing a metal object that was a perfect, one-of-a-kind duplicate of the original wax sculpture. The level of detail this technique could capture was simply unmatched by any other method. It was a breathtaking fusion of artistic vision and metallurgical precision. A smith using this process was no longer just a laborer. He was a sculptor, a chemist, and an engineer all at once. He had to understand the flow of molten metal, the behavior of different clays, the precise temperatures needed, and the artistic principles of sculpture. The objects that emerged from this process, from the serene mask of Agamemnon to the fierce ritual daggers of China, stand today as eternal testaments to the moment blacksmithing transcended mere craft and became undeniably, magnificently, both a science and an art. The creation of bronze was a technological miracle, but it birthed an economic dilemma of staggering proportions. Civilization's most vital industry now depended entirely on a metal that was infuriatingly scarce. While copper could be found in many regions, from Cyprus to the Alps, tin was a ghost. Its deposits were few, far between, and fiercely guarded. This scarcity transformed a dull gray metal into one of the most sought-after commodities in the ancient world, a substance so valuable it could make or break empires. The entire Bronze Age, for all its splendor, was balanced on a knife's edge, sustained by the most secretive and ambitious trade networks the world had ever seen. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation. A kingdom in Mesopotamia, desperate to equip its army with the latest bronze weaponry, was almost certainly entirely dependent on tin that began its journey over 3,000 miles away. The most famous and likely source was the windswept, rocky peninsula of Cornwall in the far southwestern reaches of Britain. Here, ancient miners would have excavated narrow tunnels into the earth, following rich veins of cassiterite, the primary tin ore. They'd break the rock free with stone mauls and fire, then wash the crushed ore in streams to separate the heavy, black tin crystals from the worthless dirt. These rough tin ingots would then begin an almost unbelievable journey. They were likely carried by local traders in small boats, hopping along the coast of France and Spain, a voyage known as the Atlantic Tin Route. Alternatively, they might have been hauled overland through Gaul, eventually reaching the powerful trading hubs of the Mediterranean. From there, Phoenician and Greek merchants, the master mariners of their day, would have taken possession, sailing their sturdy ships laden with cargo across the open sea to the great port cities of the Levant. Another major source likely lay in the east, in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, from where tin would travel west through a complex web of middlemen across the Iranian plateau and into Mesopotamia. These weren't simple trade routes. They were fragile, multi-stage relay races stretching across continents, with the baton being a lump of metal that could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. What's truly breathtaking is that they managed this colossal enterprise with what appears to be almost no formal documentation that has survived. We have no Bronze Age spreadsheets or shipping manifests. This trade operated on a foundation of trust, established relationships, and perhaps a system of sealed consignments that we can only guess at. It was a shadow economy run by specialized merchant families and guilds who guarded their knowledge and routes as closely as any state secret. Their power was immense. They were the only ones who knew how to connect the desperate demand of palaces with the distant, mysterious sources of supply. They were the invisible architects of international relations, their dealings as crucial as any treaty signed between kings. This immense dependence on such a long and vulnerable supply chain made the entire Bronze Age world system inherently unstable. A drought in one region could disrupt river travel. A new warlord rising to power along a key mountain pass could demand exorbitant tariffs or cut off the flow entirely. A major storm season could sink an entire fleet of tin-laden ships. Any such disruption would have sent shockwaves through the royal courts. Armies could not be raised, tools could not be replaced, and the very economy of a kingdom could grind to a halt. This constant, underlying anxiety over resources undoubtedly fueled countless military campaigns. Conquest wasn't just about glory or land. It was often a desperate attempt to secure a reliable tap for the raw materials of power, to control the mines and the trade routes themselves. Some historians now argue that it was the catastrophic collapse of these very tin networks around 1200 before the Common Era that contributed significantly to the wider Bronze Age collapse. A perfect storm of factors: mass migrations, climate change, and internal rebellions may have severed those vital arteries. Palaces that could no longer acquire tin saw their military advantage evaporate. The specialized smiths, deprived of their key ingredient, would have found their craft useless. The intricate, globalized economy that defined the era shattered into isolated, impoverished fragments, plunging the Mediterranean world into a centuries-long dark age. The pursuit of tin had built an age of wonders, and its disappearance may have been the single thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire tapestry. Yet, as the Bronze Age palaces crumbled into silence and those vast trade networks faded into legend, a new chapter was already being written in the ashes. The very collapse that made bronze an impossible luxury forced a desperate, revolutionary shift towards a metal that had been hiding in plain sight all along: iron. Unlike the exotic, travel-weary tin needed for bronze, iron ore was breathtakingly common. It was the red earth staining rivers, the heavy black stones in creek beds, the very rust-colored ground beneath people's feet. This was a resource no warlord could blockade and no storm could sink. It was everywhere, but there was a monumental catch. Unlocking this abundant metal required conquering a furnace temperature 300 degrees Celsius hotter than anything needed for copper, a fiery barrier that had long made iron the far more elusive prize. The earliest iron available to humanity wasn't mined from the earth at all. It fell from the stars. Meteoric iron, with its distinctive nickel content, was worked by skilled smiths for millennia, prized for its otherworldly origin, and forged into precious ceremonial daggers for pharaohs and kings. But to truly usher in an age of iron, they had to learn to rip the metal from its stubborn terrestrial ore. The fundamental process, called smelting, is a battle of chemistry. Iron ore is essentially rust iron atoms bonded tightly with oxygen. To win the pure metal, you have to violently divorce this partnership by stripping away the oxygen atoms. The only way to do that is to introduce a carbon-rich partner that the oxygen would find more attractive, a process known as reduction. This requires immense, focused heat and a carefully controlled environment. The first furnaces to achieve this were likely born from generations of incremental experimentation. Potters, with their mastery of high-temperature kilns, probably provided the initial blueprint. Early smiths would have begun by building tall, cylindrical chimneys from stone and clay, often partially dug into the ground for insulation. These were the first bloomery furnaces. Inside, they'd create a layered sandwich: charcoal fuel, then crushed iron ore, then more charcoal. Using foot bellows made from animal skins attached to clay tire pipes, they'd force a continuous draft of air into the base of the furnace, supercharging the combustion. This wasn't just a fire, it was a contained inferno, a forced air reactor where temperatures could finally climb past the critical threshold of 1200 degrees Celsius. But even at these staggering temperatures, the iron never actually melted like copper did. Instead, something more magical happened. The carbon monoxide from the burning charcoal would slowly pull the oxygen from the ore, leaving behind a spongy, glowing mass of nearly pure iron mixed with a rocky waste called slag. After hours of intense firing, the smith would break open the furnace to reveal this prize: an incandescent, porous lump known as a bloom. This bloom was not a shiny bar of ready-to-use metal. It was a chaotic, slag-riddled sponge that needed to be transformed through sheer physical force. While it was still white-hot, the smith would pull it from the furnace and place it on an anvil, and then the real work began. With heavy sledgehammers, they would beat the glowing mass relentlessly, folding it over and over, pounding out the liquid slag and welding the particles of pure iron into a solid, cohesive bar. This was the birth of forge welding, and it was an act of brutal artistry. Each strike was purifying the metal, consolidating it, and ultimately deciding the quality of the final product. The Iron Age wasn't forged in a melt, it was hammered into existence, one painstaking bloom at a time. Yet mastering the fiery secret of iron smelting was only half the battle. Controlling and weaponizing that knowledge became the true source of power, a lesson no one learned better than the enigmatic Hittites of ancient Anatolia. As the Bronze Age reached its peak, a stunning rumor began to circulate amongst the warring kingdoms of the Near East. It spoke of a fierce mountain people whose king commanded a guard unlike any other. Warriors armed not with bronze, but with blades of a strange, silvery metal that shone with a dull gleam. These weapons, it was whispered, did not bend in the heat of battle like copper. They did not snap under the blow of a bronze axe. They were sharper, stronger, and utterly unbreakable. The source of this terrifying advantage was the Hittite Empire, and they guarded their metallurgical secret with the fervor of a state religion. Their capital, Hattusa, was a formidable fortress city built high in the rocky highlands of what is now Turkey, a location that was no accident. This rugged terrain was not just defensible, it was incredibly rich in high-quality iron ores, particularly a type of ore that, when smelted, could produce a much harder form of iron. While other kingdoms struggled with the basic chemistry of bloomery furnaces, Hittite smiths seemed to have achieved a level of consistency and quality that was simply unmatched. But was their advantage purely geological, or was it something more? The answer likely lies in a combination of factors. They certainly had access to superior raw materials, but they also possessed a deep, proprietary understanding of the entire process. They may have perfected the use of bellows to achieve higher, more stable temperatures, or developed a specific multi-step process of heating, hammering, and folding the hot iron bloom to work out impurities and strengthen the metal, a primitive form of carburization that could create a steel-like edge. This technological edge was far too valuable to share. The Hittites didn't just have skilled blacksmiths, they had a state-enforced monopoly. Cuneiform tablets from the era, including correspondence between the Hittite king and other rulers, reveal a fascinating picture. Foreign kings would write, almost begging for gifts of iron, often being offered vast sums of gold and silver in exchange for even a single iron dagger. The Hittite response was typically a polite but firm refusal. They treated iron not as a common trade good, but as a strategic military asset on par with warships or battle plans. The knowledge of ironworking was likely concentrated within specific guilds of smiths who were bound to the royal court. Their techniques passed down within families under oath of secrecy. Spreading this knowledge to outsiders was probably considered an act of treason, punishable by death. In a world where military dominance rested on the quality of your weapons, the Hittite iron monopoly was their ultimate trump card. This leads to a compelling historical question. How much of their legendary advantage was real, and how much was brilliant propaganda? The aura of invincibility surrounding their weapons was a powerful psychological tool. The very idea of an unbreakable sword could demoralize an enemy army before the first arrow was loosed. It's entirely possible that while Hittite iron was indeed superior to the early, cruder attempts of their neighbors, it may not have been the magical substance of myth. Some of their surviving iron artifacts show varying levels of quality, suggesting the process was still incredibly difficult to master perfectly every single time. But perception is everything in warfare and diplomacy. By tightly controlling the supply and exaggerating the mystical properties of their metal, the Hittite kings crafted an image of divine favor and unbeatable strength. They became the sole brokers of a miracle, and their empire, for nearly 3 centuries, was built upon the fearsome reputation of the metal they pulled from their mountains and the fiery secrets they kept locked within their forge. This profound control over the elements placed the early blacksmith in a category far beyond that of a simple artisan. In the eyes of their community, they were alchemists and mystics, individuals who performed a miracle daily by turning stone into liquid and then into solid, purposeful form. This seemingly supernatural act meant that the smith and his forge became deeply intertwined with the spiritual and religious fabric of ancient societies. Across continents and cultures, a universal pattern emerged. The blacksmith was not just a maker of tools, he was a master of transformative power, a bridge between the mundane world and the divine, and this unique status made him a figure of both immense reverence and profound suspicion. In the pantheon of Greek mythology, this concept finds its ultimate expression in the god Hephaestus. He wasn't a distant, aloof deity hurling lightning bolts from a mountaintop. He was a working god, his divine power measured in the sweat of his brow and the heat of his forge. Cast out from Olympus for being born lame, Hephaestus built his workshop deep within a volcanic fire, and from this subterranean studio, he crafted the most magnificent objects in the known universe. His creations were the stuff of legend, the impenetrable armor of Achilles, the magical, self-driving chariot of the sun god Helios, and even the first woman, Pandora, fashioned from clay and divine breath. But his story is deeply human. He was powerful yet vulnerable, brilliant yet often mocked for his physical appearance and his soot-stained labor. This complex portrayal perfectly captures the ancient world's dual view of the smith, a being of unparalleled genius and creativity, yet also an outsider, physically marked by his craft and set apart from the rest of society. This archetype of the divine smith is a global phenomenon. In West Africa, the Yoruba people worship Ogun, a deity who is the fierce patron of all who work with iron. Ogun is not just a craftsman, he is a pathfinder, a warrior, and the spirit of civilization itself. It is he who, according to myth, first cleared the dense jungle with his iron machete, allowing humans to build their communities and roads. He is the god of technology, of progress, and of the sheer, unstoppable force required to shape the world. For a Yoruba blacksmith, to light the forge was to invoke the presence of Ogun himself. The act of smelting ore and forging metal was a sacred ritual, a participation in the god's primordial, creative power. This connection granted the smith a sacred status, but it also came with heavy taboos and responsibilities, governing everything from his behavior to the materials he could use. This spiritual association naturally led to the belief that blacksmiths possessed inherent magical abilities. If they could command fire and earth, why couldn't they command other, more mysterious forces? In many European folk traditions, smiths were thought to be able to ward off evil spirits, bless crops, or forge magical weapons that could never miss their mark. Their mastery over the four classical elements was seen as a form of elemental magic. They dug the ore from the earth, used air from their bellows to stoke the fire, and quenched the hot metal in water. This command over nature's fundamental building blocks placed them in a league with druids and sorcerers. They were often the only ones who could create the cold iron that was believed to be toxic to fairies, witches, and other supernatural creatures, making them the go-to craftsmen for protective amulets and charms. This perceived connection to the supernatural, however, was a double-edged sword. The same awe that inspired respect could also curdle into fear and suspicion. The blacksmith's workshop was a place of disquieting paradoxes. It was both life-giving and destructive, a source of creative power that also required immense, violent force. The smith himself, often physically strong and marked by burns or a limp from his demanding work, was an outsider. He lived on the edge of the village, both literally and socially, because the noise, fire, and risk of his trade were too dangerous for the community center. This isolation only fed the mystique. People relied on him for their survival, for their plowshares, their nails, their horseshoes, and their weapons. Yet they might also whisper that he consorted with demons to achieve his impossible results. He was simultaneously indispensable and untouchable, a revered craftsman and a potential warlock. His social status forever balanced precariously between reverence and fear. This incredible, almost mystical power that blacksmiths wielded, the ability to transform earth into tools and weapons, was far too valuable to remain a solitary pursuit. As demand grew across the ancient and medieval world, the craft couldn't survive on isolated genius alone. It needed structure, continuity, and protection. This necessity gave rise to one of the most influential social structures in history, the craft guild. But long before formal guilds etched their rules in parchment, the most fundamental unit of the blacksmith's world was the family. In an age without formal schools or textbooks, knowledge was a currency more valuable than gold, and the safest way to protect that currency was to keep it within the bloodline. This gave birth to true dynasties of metalworkers, where the secrets of the forge became a sacred inheritance. Imagine a boy, perhaps only 5 or 6 years old, whose entire world was the flickering light and distinctive smells of his father's workshop. His earliest memories would be the rhythmic ringing of hammer on anvil, a sound as constant and comforting as a heartbeat. He wouldn't be handed a hammer on his first day. His apprenticeship began with observation and the most mundane tasks. He was the keeper of the bellows, learning the precise rhythm of breaths needed to bring the fire from a glow to a roaring inferno. He would sweep the floor, not just to clean, but to meticulously collect every precious iron scale and fragment of wasted metal, which would be carefully melted down and reused. He learned the feel of different types of charcoal, the subtle color changes in heated metal that indicated it was ready for the hammer, and the hissing song of the blade meeting the quenching tub. This was an education absorbed through the pores, a slow, years-long process of immersion where the craft's unspoken nuances, the exact angle of a strike, the secret recipe for a hardening compound were passed down like heirlooms. A father wasn't just teaching his son a trade. He was entrusting him with the family's sole means of survival and its hard-won reputation for quality. To betray those secrets to an outsider wasn't just bad business. It was a profound act of familial treason. As towns grew into cities and commerce expanded, these family workshops began to recognize a shared interest that went beyond blood. A blacksmith in one quarter of a city might find his prices undercut by a newcomer using inferior methods. Another might see his unique design for a plow blade copied and sold by a less scrupulous competitor. To combat this and to elevate their collective status, these craftsmen began to band together, forming associations that would evolve into the powerful guilds of the Middle Ages. The Blacksmiths' Guild was far more than a social club. It was a combination of a modern-day regulatory body, a labor union, a technical school, and a secret society. Its primary mission was to protect the integrity of the craft and the economic well-being of its members. At the heart of the guild system was a rigid, three-tiered structure of apprenticeship, journeymanship, and mastership. A young man, and it was almost always a man, would be formally indentured to a master smith, often for a period of 7 years. The master provided food, lodging, and training in exchange for the boy's labor. The guild's rules strictly governed this relationship, ensuring the apprentice was taught properly and not merely used as cheap manual labor. Upon completing his term, the apprentice became a journeyman, from the French word journée, meaning day. He was now a qualified craftsman who could work for a daily wage, but he could not open his own shop. To become a master, he had to create a masterpiece, a literal piece of masterwork quality that was judged by the guild elders to prove he possessed not just skill, but excellence and innovation. This system meticulously controlled the number of masters in any given city, preventing market saturation and ensuring that those who did achieve the title were truly the best of the best. The guild's power extended deeply into the economic life of a medieval city. It held a monopoly on the practice of the trade within the city walls. It set standardized prices for goods to prevent destructive undercutting. Most importantly, it enforced quality control. Guild wardens would regularly inspect members' workshops, examining their finished products. A sword that broke too easily, a plowshare that was poorly welded, or a horseshoe that was the wrong weight would result in heavy fines or even expulsion from the guild, effectively ending the smith's career. This protected the consumer from shoddy workmanship and, crucially, protected the guild's collective reputation. A customer could buy from any guild member with the confidence that they were receiving a product that met a high, verified standard. In this way, the guild stamp became one of the earliest forms of a trusted brand. Yet for all their benefits in maintaining quality and fairness, These guilds were also fiercely insular and restrictive. Their secret techniques, recipes for steel, methods for achieving specific tempers, patterns for unique tools were guarded with a paranoid intensity. Spilling these secrets to someone outside the guild, or even to a member of a different guild in a rival city, was considered a grave offense. This culture of secrecy, while born from a desire to protect a livelihood, inevitably slowed the spread of innovation. A revolutionary technique discovered by a smith in Florence might take decades to reach London, if it ever did. The guild system created pockets of isolated excellence, brilliant but sequestered, their knowledge flowing in a trickle rather than a stream. It was a paradoxical world where the very structures created to perfect and protect a craft could also, in time, become the walls that held it back from evolving even further. While the guilds of continental Europe were building walls of tradition and secrecy, a very different kind of blacksmith was fueling an era of breathtaking expansion from the north. The Viking Age was not just built on the daring of its sailors and the ferocity of its warriors. It was forged in the smoky, subterranean workshops of Norse smiths. These craftsmen were the unsung engineers of exploration and conquest, producing the resilient tools and devastating weapons that allowed Viking crews to survive unimaginable journeys and dominate battlefields from Newfoundland to Constantinople. Their success hinged on an intimate understanding of a brutal, fundamental truth. The unforgiving environment of the North demanded equipment of unparalleled durability. A poorly welded axe head shattering in the frozen forests of Ruse could mean death. A corroded rivet failing on a longship in the North Atlantic could mean an entire crew lost to the depths. The Norse smith's reputation, and the lives of his community, depended on his ability to conquer fallibility with fire and hammer. This relentless pursuit of reliability led to one of the most aesthetically and technically stunning achievements in ancient metallurgy: pattern welding. This was not a method for the impatient or the unskilled. It was a laborious, weeks-long process of meticulous layering and manipulation. The smith would begin by taking multiple thin rods of iron, intentionally alternating between soft, low-carbon iron and harder, high-carbon steel. These rods were bundled together, heated to a brilliant welding heat in a charcoal fire, and then painstakingly hammered into a single, solid bar. This bar was then twisted, sometimes multiple times, into a tight spiral before being hammered flat again. This entire process was repeated, often with several of these intricately patterned bars being welded together side by side to form the core of a blade. The result was a composite material of breathtaking complexity. The different metals, with their varying resistances to the etcher's acid applied centuries later, would reveal the legendary swirling patterns, the smoky ripples and labyrinthine designs that looked like the fingerprints of a god. But this was far more than decorative artistry. It was sophisticated materials engineering. This technique effectively created a form of prehistoric plywood for metal, distributing the hard, brittle steel within a flexible matrix of softer iron. The resulting sword was a masterwork of balanced performance, a blade that could hold a razor-sharp, hard steel edge capable of shearing through mail, while the twisted iron core absorbed the tremendous shock of impact, preventing the weapon from snapping in the chaos of a shield wall. Perhaps no artifact better exemplifies the zenith of this craft and its connection to a vast, sophisticated network than the enigmatic Ulfbert swords. Around 170 of these weapons have been discovered in Viking graves and riverbanks across Europe, all dating from the 9th to the 11th centuries. What sets them apart is the stunning quality of their steel and the mysterious inscription inlaid into their blades, plus VLFBert plus. Metallurgical analysis has revealed a shocking truth. Many of these blades were made from crucible steel, a material of such purity and high carbon content that it was thought to be impossible for European smiths to produce at the time. This steel was remarkably free of the slag inclusions that weakened most contemporary weapons, making the Ulfbert blades lighter, stronger, more flexible, and capable of taking a far superior edge. They were, by every measure, superweapons. The origin of this steel points to a trade network of staggering distance and complexity. The only known source of such pure crucible steel in that era was thousands of miles to the east, in the workshops of Persia and Central Asia. This means the raw material for an Ulfbert blade likely began its life as a cake of imported Persian ingot steel, known as fulad. This precious material would have traveled along the Volga trade routes, controlled by the Rus Vikings, through the Black Sea and up the river systems of Eastern Europe, eventually making its way to a master smith, likely in the Rhineland, who possessed the secret of working it. The +VLF Bert plus inscription was not a maker's signature but a powerful brand name, a guarantee of quality and origin that was recognized and revered across the known world. It signifies a pre-industrial version of globalized manufacturing, with raw materials sourced from the East, forged by Frankish craftsmen using techniques honed in the North, and wielded by a Norse elite. The man who owned such a sword was not just carrying a weapon, he was bearing a symbol of immense wealth, connections, and access to a technological secret that placed him a cut above his foes. This unprecedented era of construction created a seismic shift in the blacksmith's professional life. No longer a traveling tinker moving from village to repair tools, the medieval smith found a permanent home. These massive building sites, which could take decades or even centuries to complete, required a full-time on-site forge. A master smith would be contracted for the duration, establishing a fixed workshop right there in the shadow of the rising stone walls. This stability was transformative. Instead of a portable anvil and a simple set of tools that could be carried on a cart, the smith could now invest in large, heavy, and highly specialized equipment that was far too cumbersome to move. Massive, permanent anvils were set on great oak stumps sunk into the earth. They built larger, more efficient furnaces and installed complex water-powered trip hammers and grinding wheels along nearby streams. This move from itinerant craftsman to established shop owner with sophisticated machinery marked a critical turning point, elevating the trade from a nomadic service to a cornerstone of permanent, urban industry. The sheer diversity of metalwork required by these monumental projects and the societies they supported necessitated an unprecedented division of labor. A general-purpose village smith could no longer master the ever-growing list of highly specialized tasks. This led to the formal fracturing of the trade into distinct, guild-regulated specialties, each with its own secrets, tools, and revered masters. The armorer, for instance, was a league of his own. He wasn't just making mail, he was meticulously forming and heat-treating articulated plate steel gauntlets, helmet visors, and breastplates that could deflect a lance strike. The bladesmith dedicated his life to the sacred geometry of the sword, mastering the subtle curves, fullers, and tempering lines that created a perfectly balanced weapon. Then there was the farrier, whose entire world revolved around the anatomy of the horse, expertly shaping and nailing shoes that would protect the vital transport and cavalry of the age. Other specialists included the locksmith, who crafted the intricate mechanisms that secured castle doors and treasure chests, and the nailsmith, whose sole, repetitive task was to produce the millions of nails needed for timber framing and furniture. This hyper-specialization was the medieval version of an assembly line, ensuring every component was made with an expert's touch. Mastering such a complex and physically demanding craft required a rigorous and often grueling education, formalized under the strict structure of the guild system. For a young boy, entering this world meant signing away 7 years of his life as an apprentice, a period often starting as early as age 12. His contract, signed by his father and the master smith, was a binding legal document. In exchange for his labor, the master provided not just training, but also food, lodging, and a surrogate family structure. The apprentice's education was holistic and hierarchical. His first years were consumed by the most menial tasks, manning the massive bellows for hours on end to keep the forge fire at precisely the right temperature, a job that required immense stamina and attention to detail. He would sweep the shop floor, not just for cleanliness, but to collect every precious speck of iron dust and scrap metal for recycling. Through constant observation, he learned the language of the forge, the color changes in heated metal that signaled it was ready for the hammer, from a low red to a brilliant yellow-white. He learned the sounds, the ring of a good weld, the dull thud of a cold shut, the hiss of the quench. This was an education of immersion, where the craft's deepest secrets were absorbed through the skin and the ears long before they were ever explained. Only after years of this foundational training would he be trusted to hold a hammer for more than basic striking. The master would gradually introduce him to the actual shaping of metal, starting with simple projects like nails or basic hooks. Each step was a test of skill, patience, and strength. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Burns were a daily occurrence, and the risk of serious injury from a missed hammer blow or a shattering piece of hot metal was ever present. The apprenticeship was as much a test of character as it was of skill. It forged resilience and discipline alongside the ability to shape iron. Upon finally completing his 7-year term, the young man would create his masterpiece, a piece of work judged by the guild elders to prove he had achieved not just competence, but excellence. This system, for all its rigidity, was astonishingly effective. It produced generations of craftsmen whose skill level was so high that their work, from the intricate lock of a cathedral door to the delicate articulation of a suit of plate armor, remains awe-inspiring even today, a timeless testament to the power of dedicated, lifelong mastery. For centuries, the blacksmith's rhythm was dictated by human muscle and lung power, the relentless, exhausting swing of the arm and the constant, draining push and pull of the bellows. This physical ceiling limited everything: the size of the objects that could be forged, the temperature the furnace could reach, and ultimately, the quantity and quality of the iron produced. But in the High Middle Ages, a new rhythm began to echo across the European countryside, a sound that would fundamentally shatter those ancient limitations. It was the deep, resonant, and mechanical thump of the water-powered hammer, an innovation that didn't just improve blacksmithing, it industrialized it. This revolution began not at the forge, but at the riverbank. For generations, water wheels had been used to grind grain, but their potential to drive other machinery was a sleeping giant. Some visionary individual, whose name is lost to history, made a brilliant connection. They saw the relentless, powerful rotation of a water wheel and imagined harnessing that motion not to turn a millstone, but to lift a massive forge hammer and then let it drop with a force no human arm could ever match. The mechanics were ingeniously simple. A rotating cam on the water wheel's axle would lift a large wooden hammer shaft. As the wheel turned, the cam would eventually release, and the hammer would drop onto the anvil below with a thunderous, earth-shaking blow. This was the birth of the trip hammer, and its impact was immediate and profound. Suddenly, the most physically exhausting part of the process, the initial hammering of a large iron bloom to consolidate it, could be handled by a machine that never tired. A single water wheel could operate multiple hammers simultaneously, their blows falling in a rhythmic, mechanical cacophony of progress. This allowed smiths to work larger blooms than ever before, producing bigger, more uniform bars of iron in a fraction of the time. But the water wheel's power wasn't limited to hammering. The same principle was applied to the bellows. Large, piston-driven bellows were connected to the wheel, providing a continuous, powerful, and steady blast of air into the furnace. This constant draft was a game-changer for temperature control. It could push a furnace consistently beyond the 1200-degree mark, allowing for more efficient smelting from the ore and, crucially, creating the conditions necessary to actually melt iron for casting, a process that had been impossible in Europe since the days of the Romans. For the first time, the smith could command a fire of truly industrial intensity, and he could hold that intensity for as long as the river flowed. This technological leap triggered a massive geographical and economic shift. Blacksmithing was no longer a craft tied to any village with a road. It was now chained to the rivers that provided its power. Manufacturing began to cluster along fast-flowing streams, particularly in regions with abundant water and iron ore. Small hamlets grew into booming industrial centers almost overnight. Places like the Weald in England, the Basque Country in Spain, and the Rhine Valley in Germany became the Silicon Valleys of medieval metal production. These were no longer mere workshops. They were the world's first true factories, with forges operating day and night. Their output limited only by the flow of the river and the supply of raw materials. The scale of production these centers achieved was previously unimaginable. A single water-powered forge complex could output enough iron weaponry to equip an entire army in a matter of months. Kingdoms now had the capacity to mass-produce standardized arms and armor on a scale that could decide the fate of wars. It wasn't just about weapons either. These forges produced the heavy iron parts for shipbuilding, the thousands of nails needed for burgeoning cities, and the strong tools required to clear forests and farm land on an ever-expanding frontier. The water wheel had transformed the blacksmith from an artisan serving a local community into a cog in a vast, proto-industrial machine that was building the modern world, one powerful, mechanical hammer blow at a time. Even with the relentless power of the water wheel amplifying their efforts, the fundamental process of making iron remained a batch operation, constrained by the size of a single bloomery furnace. The dream of a truly continuous, river-like flow of molten metal seemed just out of reach, but that dream was about to become a roaring reality with an innovation so profound it would dwarf all that came before it, the blast furnace. Emerging in the late medieval period, this technological titan didn't just improve iron production, it completely redefined it, shifting the entire industry from an artisanal craft into the realm of heavy industry and setting the stage for the modern world. The blast furnace's genius lay in its monumental scale and its elegant, continuous operation. Unlike the traditional bloomery, which was a single batch process chamber, the blast furnace was a towering edifice of stone and brick, often reaching heights of 30 feet or more. It was a permanent, imposing structure, a cathedral dedicated to the mass production of metal. Its internal design was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. The furnace was charged from the top in a continuous cycle. Layers of iron ore, charcoal fuel, and a limestone flux were dumped into the stack in a carefully calculated ratio. The limestone acted as a flux, bonding with the impurities in the ore to form a waste slag that could be easily separated. But the true magic, the blast in blast furnace, came from the powerful, continuous air forced into the base of the structure. Massive water wheel-powered bellows, far larger than anything used before, pumped a hurricane of air into the furnace through openings called tires. This supercharged airflow created a ferocious inferno, driving temperatures to heights previously unimaginable well over 1,500 degrees Celsius. At this extreme heat, a chemical revolution occurred. The iron ore didn't just soften into a spongy bloom, it underwent a complete phase change, melting entirely into a liquid. This molten iron, being heavier, trickled down to the very bottom of the furnace, pooling in a glowing white-hot reservoir. The lighter slag floated on top of this iron lake like a scum. This continuous process meant the furnace could operate for weeks, or even months on end, constantly being fed from the top and regularly tapped from the bottom to release the liquid metal. The output was staggering. A single blast furnace could produce more iron in a day than a traditional bloomery forge could manage in an entire season. This was no longer just production, it was generation. This river of molten iron created a brand new possibility: cast iron. For the first time, metal was liquid and abundant enough to be poured directly into intricate sand molds, much like bronze had been for millennia. This opened up a world of products that were previously unthinkable or impossibly labor-intensive to forge by hand. Now, foundries could produce hundreds of identical cannonballs in a single pour, equipping the burgeoning artillery of Renaissance armies. They could cast massive cooking pots, firebacks for grand fireplaces, and even early machine parts with a speed and consistency that hand forging could never match. The age of mass-produced iron goods had dawned. This seismic shift sent conflicting shockwaves through the world of traditional blacksmiths. On one hand, it presented an existential threat. The very definition of their craft, the skilled, hands-on transformation of a solid bloom into a useful object through hammer and anvil was being bypassed at the source. Why would anyone spend days hammering a bloom into a bar, when they could simply tap a furnace and pour molten iron into a mold to create a finished product in minutes. The blast furnace seemed to render the smiths' most fundamental skills obsolete, potentially reducing them to mere mold makers or furnace tenders in a new, industrialized hierarchy. Yet, in a fascinating twist, this same technology also created incredible new opportunities. The blast furnace didn't eliminate the need for the blacksmith, it transformed their role. The cast iron it produced was brittle, excellent for cannonballs and pots, but terrible for tools or weapons that needed flexibility and strength. This created a crucial demand for a secondary stage of production, fining or puddling. Specialized smiths, now working in large forges attached to the furnace complexes, took the brittle cast iron, pigs, and patiently reheated them in a finery hearth. Through a careful process of oxidation, they would burn off the excess carbon that made the iron brittle, gradually converting it into a malleable form of wrought iron. This wrought iron then became the raw material for other smiths to craft into everything from nails and horseshoes to tools and hardware. Furthermore, the sheer abundance of cheap iron meant that more people than ever could afford metal goods, creating a booming market that required more smiths to do the finishing work, not fewer. The blast furnace didn't kill the blacksmith's trade. It forced it to evolve, splitting it into distinct specializations of mass production and precision craftsmanship, and setting the foundation for the Industrial Revolution that was still centuries away. Yet even with the blast furnace fueling the ambitions of empires, all that iron was useless without the skilled hands to shape it into the specific instruments of expansion. As European powers set their sights on distant continents, the blacksmith's forge became the essential launch pad for colonization, the one trade without which the entire enterprise would have foundered before it even left the harbor. Before a single settler could set foot in the New World, before a single cannon could be fired in conquest, an army of smiths was already at work, forging the very sinews of empire. The most immediate and overwhelming demand came from the shipyards. To build the vessels that would brave the Atlantic, thousands upon thousands of iron nails were required, not just any nails, but specialized, hand-forged ship nails of incredible variety and strength. There were thick, sturdy deck nails, long, sharp clinch nails for fastening planks, and massive tree nails for critical structural joints. Every single one was hammered out individually by a nailsmith. Beyond nails, smiths produced the heavy metal fittings that held the ship together. Massive anchor chains, rudder hardware, iron bands for the masts, and the all-important guns and cannons themselves. The Spanish Armada, the English fleet, the Portuguese caravels, these famous vessels were not just feats of woodworking. They were floating monuments to the blacksmith's craft, their hulls literally stitched together with iron. The colonial project was, first and foremost, a metallurgical one, and it sailed on a sea of hand-forged metal. Once these ships arrived on distant shores, the blacksmith's role shifted from builder to survivalist. The first structures in Jamestown, Quebec, or Cape Town were not houses or churches. They were a forge and a palisade. The colonial smith was arguably the most important person in any fledgling settlement, a one-man industrial base tasked with creating everything a community needed to exist. With no supply chain to rely on, his resourcefulness was pushed to the absolute limit. A European smith arriving in North America would have been horrified to find the familiar, high-quality iron ore of his homeland replaced by strange, often inferior bog iron or deposits he didn't recognize. He had to learn, through desperate trial and error, how to adapt his traditional techniques to these new materials. The charcoal he used for fuel had to be made from local American hardwoods like hickory or oak, which burned differently than the European beech or birch he was accustomed to. Every tool, every nail, every hinge, and every weapon needed for defense against perceived threats had to be made from scratch, often recycling broken tools or scrap metal because shipments from Europe were unreliable and could take years to arrive. The colonial smith wasn't just a craftsman, he was an alchemist of necessity, constantly innovating to keep the fragile flame of settlement alive. This encounter between European and indigenous metalworking traditions was not a simple story of technological transfer. It was a complex and often violent clash of knowledge, economics, and culture. In the Americas, many societies, particularly in North America, had sophisticated traditions of working native copper through cold hammering and annealing, creating beautiful ceremonial objects and practical tools. They did not, however, practice smelting the extraction of metal from ore using extreme heat. When they encountered Europeans who could pull liquid metal from rock, their reactions were a mixture of awe, curiosity, and strategic interest. Some Native American tribes, like the Iroquois Confederacy, quickly recognized the immense practical value of iron tools and weapons. They became active and savvy participants in the fur trade, negotiating for metal axes, knives, and kettle scraps, which their own smiths would then rework into arrowheads and other items. For a time, this was a relationship of mutual, if tense, exchange. In West Africa, the encounter was entirely different. Europeans arrived on a coast that was already home to advanced and ancient ironworking civilizations. The Nok culture had been smelting iron in Nigeria since around 1000 before the Common Era. Kingdoms like the Yoruba of Oyo and the Fan of Dahomey had powerful guilds of blacksmiths who were not ONLY Chinese letter skilled, but held immense spiritual and political status, often directly serving the king. They produced magnificent sculptures, sophisticated agricultural tools, and incredibly effective weaponry, like the famous throwing irons of the Dahomey army. When European traders arrived offering mass-produced goods, these African smiths were not naive primitives to be easily impressed. They were discerning critics of metallurgical quality. They often viewed European iron as inferior to their own carefully smelted and worked metal. While African leaders did trade for European metals, it was often to acquire raw material in the form of bar iron or manila bracelets, which their own superior smiths would then reforge into objects that fit their own cultural and functional needs. In this context, European metal was not a technology to be adopted, but a raw resource to be appropriated and mastered by an already advanced craft tradition. In both continents, the ultimate goal of European colonialism was to break this independence and create economic dependence. Colonial powers actively sought to suppress local metal production to ensure a market for their own manufactured goods. They wanted to sell finished axes, not trade bar iron. They wanted to make indigenous populations customers, not competitors. This led to policies designed to dismantle local smithing industries, a form of economic warfare that had devastating long-term effects. The story of the colonial blacksmith is therefore a tale of two forges: one, a tool of imposition and survival for the settler, and the other, a site of resilience, adaptation, and often resistance for indigenous cultures who fought to maintain their own technological sovereignty against overwhelming force. This wave of mechanization, however, created a powerful and unsettling countercurrent for the traditional village smith. For centuries, his had been the most essential workshop in any community, the resonant clang of his hammer, a universal soundtrack to daily life. But now, the sheer scale and speed of factory production presented an existential challenge. How could a single artisan, working with muscle and simple tools, possibly compete with a mechanized factory that could stamp out 100 identical horseshoes in the time it took him to forge one? The economic pressure was immense. Factories benefited from economies of scale, bulk raw material purchases, and powered machinery, allowing them to offer standardized nails, hinges, and tools at a fraction of the cost of a hand-forged equivalent. For the first time, the blacksmith's product was being judged not just on its renowned durability, but on its price tag, and in that new arena, he was at a severe disadvantage. Faced with this tectonic shift, blacksmiths did not simply vanish. They displayed a remarkable capacity for adaptation and reinvention. The very nature of their craft, built on solving problems with heat and hammer, prepared them to navigate this new industrial landscape. One primary survival strategy was a decisive pivot from mass production to customization and repair. A factory could produce 1 million identical door latches, but it couldn't come to your farm to fix a broken plowshare or craft a custom fitting part for a unique, irreplaceable piece of machinery. The blacksmith became the indispensable repairman of the industrial age, his skill in welding and reshaping metal ensuring that expensive industrial and agricultural equipment could be kept running long past its intended lifespan. This role made him more vital than ever to the agricultural economy, even as factory-made goods flooded the market. Another path was specialization. Some smiths leaned into high-end artistic metalwork, creating ornate wrought iron gates, stair railings, and decorative pieces for the wealthy homeowners and new municipal buildings of the Victorian era. This elevated their work from mere commodity to artisanal luxury, a status symbol that stood in deliberate contrast to the plain, functional output of the factories. Others carved out a niche in serving remote rural communities that lay beyond the efficient reach of railroad distribution networks. In these areas, the local smith remained the sole source for metal goods and repairs, his value undiminished by the distant hum of industry. Furthermore, a significant number of these craftsmen made the direct transition into the industrial heartland itself. Their intimate understanding of metal's behavior made them perfectly suited to become the foremen, welders, machinists, and maintenance experts within the very factories that had threatened their trade. The same hands that once hammered a plow now maintained the colossal steam hammers and powered rollers, applying centuries of accumulated knowledge to a new, industrial context. Despite this pragmatic adaptation, a powerful cultural narrative began to take hold in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the romantic tragedy of the last blacksmith. This figure, often portrayed as a lonely, aging artisan working in a dying trade, became a potent symbol of a world perceived to be lost to mechanization and soulless progress. Poets, painters, and writers frequently sentimentalized the smithy as a place of authentic, meaningful labor, contrasting its warm, individual creativity with the cold, repetitive anonymity of the factory floor. This nostalgic lens, however, often obscured the more complex reality. While it was true that the number of traditional, general-purpose village smithies declined dramatically, the craft itself had not died, it had metamorphosed. The narrative of the last smith was more a lament for a certain way of life than an accurate obituary for the skills themselves. It overlooked the many smiths who successfully evolved, finding new purpose and economic viability by integrating their irreplaceable skills into the very fabric of the modern, industrial world they were said to be a relic of. While the roar of the blast furnace signaled the dawn of industrial might, the true heart of the blacksmith's art has always beat upon a much more personal stage, the anvil. This seemingly simple block of metal is far more than a work surface. It is the sacred altar of the craft, the anvil's unique geometry acting as a direct transcript of the smith's intentions, a physical key that unlocks the potential within glowing steel. To trace its evolution is to map the expanding imagination of metalworking itself. The very first anvils were not even metal. They were simply large, flat, hard stones, river cobbles, or slabs of granite used to cold hammer native copper or meteoric iron. These primitive platforms offered a hard, unyielding surface, but they were passive partners in the process, limiting the smith to basic flattening and shaping. The true revolution began when blacksmiths started to forge their own anvils. The earliest metal anvils were often just large, squared blocks of wrought iron. But as the craft advanced, so did the tool's sophistication. A pivotal innovation was the addition of the horn, that iconic, curved beak protruding from one end. This single feature exponentially increased the anvil's versatility. The horn provided a rounded surface for hammering curves and rings, allowing a smith to create everything from the seamless circle of a horseshoe to the elegant spiral of a scroll. Without it, forming such shapes would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Then came the Hardy and Pritchell holes, square and round holes punched into the anvil's face. These weren't just for storage, they were mounting points for a whole suite of secondary tools called bottom tools. A smith could slot a specialized cutting tool called a Hardy into its square hole, allowing him to chop hot metal cleanly against the anvil's solid mass. The round Pritchell hole was used for punching holes through hot metal or for holding tools to bend or drift shapes. This transformed the anvil from a passive block into an active, multi-functional workbench, a single, solid foundation that could host an entire repertoire of specialized techniques. Perhaps the most crucial and hidden feature of a quality anvil is its steel face. Early iron anvils would have dented and deformed under repeated hammer blows. To solve this, smiths developed the technique of face welding or steeling. They would weld a thin plate of much harder, high-carbon steel onto the top surface of the softer wrought iron body. This created a perfect marriage of properties. The tough, shock-absorbing iron body prevented the anvil from cracking, while the hardened steel face resisted deformation and provided a pristine, resilient surface that would bounce the hammer back with energetic efficiency. The creation of a high-quality anvil was therefore a meta project, a masterpiece of forging that demonstrated a smith's highest level of skill, because it was the tool that would then be used to create all others. This silent evolution of form, frozen in ancient and medieval anvils unearthed by archaeologists, provides a startlingly clear window into the techniques of the past. An anvil is a direct impression of the work it was meant to perform. An anvil found with a wide, flat face and a sharp, square edge suggests a smith who specialized in forging tools and blades, where clean angles and flat surfaces were essential. An anvil with a slender, tapered horn might indicate a specialist in decorative or delicate work. By studying the wear patterns, the dings and grooves worn into the face over centuries, we can almost see the ghosts of projects past the repeated hammering of knife blades along one edge, the rounding of hundreds of horseshoes over the horn. These artifacts allow us to reverse engineer entire workshops, a discovery of a specific type of anvil alongside certain hammer shapes and metal scraps can tell us not just what they were making, but with a startling degree of accuracy, how they were making it. This physical evidence highlights a profound truth about ancient and medieval technology. The most advanced knowledge was often held not in libraries, but in the muscles and minds of the craftsmen. The intricate dance of heat, hammer, and hand was an oral tradition, a symphony of skill passed directly from master to apprentice through years of careful observation and practiced repetition. A master wouldn't hand his apprentice a manual on the exact temperature to forge weld steel. He would show him the precise shade of incandescent yellow-white that signaled the metal was ready, a color that is nearly impossible to accurately describe in words. The exact angle of the hammer strike, the specific way to hold the tongue to direct a stream of air from the bellows, the secret recipe for a quenching fluid, these were all trade secrets, guarded fiercely and transmitted through demonstration. The anvil was the silent, steadfast witness to this entire process, the unchanging reference point around which this intimate, unspoken education took place. Its enduring, evolving design is the closest thing we have to a physical textbook of the blacksmith's art, a testament to a vast reservoir of sophisticated knowledge that was written not on parchment, but in the very tools that built the world. In a world where your reputation was your most valuable asset and your technical knowledge was your family's fortune, blacksmiths developed sophisticated, unspoken systems to communicate, protect, and prove their work. This wasn't just about making a good product, it was about embedding your identity and your guarantee into the very metal you shaped. The most universal of these systems was the smith's mark, a unique symbol stamped onto a finished piece that functioned as a signature, a warranty, and a brand logo all in one. Imagine a Viking warrior examining a sword before a raid, his eyes scanning the blade not just for its edge, but for a specific, trusted pattern of swirls or a runic inscription. Finding that mark meant confidence, it was a silent promise that the weapon wouldn't fail him in the shield wall. These marks were the bedrock of commercial trust in an era without product liability laws. A farmer purchasing a new plowshare would look for the mark of a local smith known for durability. If that tool shattered on a hidden route, the farmer knew exactly whose forge to return to for a replacement or a refund. This system of accountability created a powerful incentive for quality and turned a smith's personal mark into a symbol of his honor and his entire lineage's credibility. Beyond simple ownership, these marks could convey a wealth of hidden information to those in the know. The location of the stamp could indicate the type of metal used or the intended purpose of the object. A mark on the tang of a knife might signify it was made from a particular batch of steel, while the same mark on the blade could denote it was a demonstration piece for a journeyman's masterpiece exam. Guilds institutionalized this practice, requiring members to register their unique marks in ledgers. This allowed wardens to trace faulty or dangerous goods back to their source, levying fines against smiths whose work endangered the public or brought disgrace upon the guild's hard-won reputation. This created a closed loop of quality control that protected both the consumer and the integrity of the craft itself. A guild mark stamped beside a personal mark was the highest seal of approval, telling the world that this object met the rigorous, standardized quality of a specific city's craftsmen. It was a system built on transparency and traceability, concepts we still value in manufacturing today. The need for secrecy extended far beyond simple marks and into the very language smiths used amongst themselves. The forge had its own lexicon, a technical jargon that served as a protective barrier. Terms for specific techniques, temperatures, and recipes were often deliberately obscure. The critical color changes that signal, a metal's readiness from blood red to cherry to the brilliant yellow-white of welding heat, were described in metaphors and comparisons that would be meaningless to an outsider. A master might tell his apprentice that the steel was sweating or had the color of a morning star, to indicate it was at the perfect moment for a quench. This wasn't just poetic, it was practical security. A conversation between two smiths about the best flux to use for welding could be held in plain earshot of a visiting merchant without revealing any actual useful information. This specialized language ensured that the deepest secrets of the craft could only be understood through years of immersive apprenticeship, safeguarding the trade's mysteries from casual observation or industrial espionage. This culture of secrecy reached its absolute zenith around certain legendary techniques, the most famous of which is the mysterious art of making Damascus steel. These blades, famed for their mesmerizing, watery patterns on the surface and their legendary sharpness and flexibility, were the superweapons of their day. Their origin lay in the East, with the Wootz steel produced in ancient India. This was a crucible steel, made by melting iron with specific carbon-rich materials in a sealed clay pot, resulting in an ingot of steel containing unique carbide banding. When a skilled smith forged this ingot into a blade, the banding was stretched and manipulated, creating those iconic, swirling patterns. The exact recipe for the raw material, the precise temperature control for the melt, and the specific forging rhythm required to draw out the pattern without destroying it were secrets so closely guarded that they were often confined to a single family or a small guild. The smiths who mastered this craft weren't just making weapons, they were weaving metal, and they protected their methods with a possessiveness that bordered on the religious. When the specific sources of iron ore in India dried up or the trade routes that distributed Wootz steel were disrupted, the knowledge, having never been widely written down, faded into obscurity. The secret died with its masters, turning Damascus steel from a manufacturable product into an unrepeatable legend, a permanent testament to the immense power that could be wielded by those who held, and ultimately protected, the blacksmith's most profound secrets. The story of iron has often been told as a linear march of progress from the Middle East through Europe, but this narrative completely ignores a parallel revolution of breathtaking sophistication that was unfolding across the African continent. Long before the Hittites guarded their secrets, and entirely independent of influences from the north or east, African metallurgists were unlocking the secrets of the earth in their own ingenious ways. This was not a borrowed technology. It was a brilliant, homegrown innovation that would produce some of the most advanced and beautiful metalwork the world has ever seen. The evidence for this independent discovery is both ancient and undeniable. In the heart of sub-Saharan Africa, at a site called Leja in modern-day Nigeria, archaeologists have uncovered slag heaps and evidence of iron smelting that have been radiocarbon dated to before 2000 before the Common Era. That is contemporary with, and in some cases even earlier than, the very beginnings of ironworking in Anatolia. This wasn't a case of knowledge slowly trickling down trade routes. This was a separate, simultaneous awakening to the potential hidden within certain rocks. Different cultures across the vast continent developed their own unique spiritual and practical relationships with metal. For the Nok culture, ironworking was intimately tied to their iconic terracotta sculptures. For the Swahili coast civilizations, it was linked to their vast Indian Ocean trade networks. Each region developed its own myths and rituals around the smith, who was often seen as a mediator between the earthly and spiritual realms, a master of transformative power. The pinnacle of this independent innovation was a furnace design of such elegant efficiency that it far surpassed anything in contemporary Europe. While European bloomery furnaces struggled to reach consistent temperatures, African smiths, particularly in regions like the Great Lakes, developed the forced draft furnace. This wasn't just a pile of rocks with a bellows attached. It was a masterpiece of terracotta engineering. These tall, cylindrical furnaces were often built with multiple clay tire pipes directed inward from the base, all converging on the heart of the fire. This design didn't just blow air into the furnace. It created a concentrated, superheated vortex of oxygen that drove temperatures higher and more consistently than any European bellows system could manage. The result was a much more complete reduction of the iron ore and a larger, higher quality bloom. This technological advantage allowed African smiths to work with a purer form of iron and achieve technical results that European smiths, with their less efficient furnaces, would not match for centuries. This technical mastery found its most stunning expression not in iron, but in the magnificent bronze and brass castings of the Benin Kingdom, in what is now Nigeria. The Benin bronzes are not merely artifacts, they are a gallery of history, a courtly archive cast in metal. Using the sophisticated lost wax method, Benin's Guild of Royal Smiths created intricate plaques, elaborate sculptures of animals, and hauntingly naturalistic portrait heads of obas and courtiers. The level of detail is astonishing. Every woven thread of a tunic, every bead of a necklace, every subtle expression is captured with a precision that reveals an intimate understanding of both human anatomy and the fluid properties of molten metal. These pieces were not made for common use. They were a form of political propaganda, displayed in the royal palace to document the kingdom's history, power, and divine right to rule. They stand as an irrefutable testament to an artistic and technical tradition that was the equal of, and in many ways superior to, anything being produced in Renaissance Europe at the same time. Far from being isolated, African metalworking was a dynamic force in a sprawling global economy. The trans-Saharan trade routes were not just conduits for gold and salt. They were highways for technological exchange. High-carbon steel from West Africa, produced in those advanced forced draft furnaces, was highly prized and traded north. Conversely, the massive copper deposits of Central Africa became the engine for a vast regional trade network. In the Upemba depression of the Congo Basin, the skilled metalworkers of the Luba and Lunda cultures forged exquisite copper crosses into standardized ingots. These weren't just raw materials, they were a form of currency, a store of value that was used in a sophisticated economic system spanning thousands of miles. This demonstrates a conceptual understanding of metal that went far beyond the utilitarian. It was integral to commerce, art, and social structure on a continental scale. The encounter between European traders and African metalworking cultures utterly shatters the outdated colonial myth of technological superiority. When Portuguese merchants arrived on the coast of West Africa in the 15th century, they weren't meeting people unfamiliar with metal. They were encountering established kingdoms with guilds of smiths who had been perfecting their craft for over 2 millennia. These African smiths were discerning critics. They often found European iron to be of inferior quality to their own carefully produced blooms, and frequently preferred to trade for raw metal bars, manila bracelets, and iron rods, which they would then melt down and rework using their own superior techniques into objects that suited their own cultural and functional needs. They were not passive recipients of European technology. They were active, sophisticated consumers who appropriated foreign materials and subsumed them into their own far older and deeply rooted technological traditions. A powerful reminder that the flow of innovation and skill has never moved in just one direction. While Europe was navigating the age of bronze and the early challenges of iron, a parallel revolution of metallurgical genius was unfolding in the East, where philosophical principles and cultural values shaped a distinct and breathtakingly advanced path of metal mastery. In China, the pursuit of mastery took a turn toward the monumental and the mass-producible, leading to a discovery that would elude the West for over 1,000 years: the efficient production of cast iron. As early as the 5th century before the Common Era, during the tumultuous but intellectually fertile Warring States period, Chinese metallurgists achieved a monumental breakthrough. By constructing massive, furnace-like kilns and employing powerful box bellows often operated by teams of men or even water wheels, they could generate a consistent, ferocious blast of air. This engineering marvel pushed their furnaces to temperatures exceeding 1,300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to completely liquefy iron ore on an industrial scale. This ability to produce vast quantities of liquid iron was a game-changer for Chinese civilization. It allowed for the mass casting of items that were the bedrock of state power and agricultural prosperity. Foundries could produce thousands of identical, heavy iron plowshares that dramatically increased farming efficiency and fed a growing population. They cast the deadly, standardized parts for advanced crossbow triggers that equipped the vast armies of competing states. Perhaps most impressively, they began casting enormous cauldrons and intricate agricultural tools, turning iron from a rare, laboriously forged commodity into a common, accessible material. This technological edge was a key factor in the eventual unification of China under the Qin dynasty, whose military might was built upon a foundation of mass-produced iron weaponry. The Chinese mastery of cast iron represents a philosophy of metalworking oriented toward utility, scale, and the empowerment of the state, a stark contrast to the individual artistry emerging elsewhere. That contrast finds its most poetic expression in the islands of Japan, where metalworking evolved into a form of spiritual discipline. Here, the goal was not volume, but perfection. The creation of the legendary Japanese katana is perhaps the most revered and ritualized craft in human history, a process where the smith is seen not merely as an artisan, but as a priest conducting a sacred ceremony. The entire endeavor was steeped in the principles of Shintoism and Zen Buddhism, viewing the forge as a pure space and the act of creation as a meditation. The smith would often undergo strict purification rites, wearing white robes, abstaining from certain foods, and praying before even approaching the fire. This was because they believed the sword possessed a soul, a tamashii, and the smith's own spirit and intention were woven directly into the steel with every hammer blow. The technical process itself was a breathtaking symphony of layered complexity. It began with tatara steel, a unique form of high-carbon steel smelted from iron sand in a clay furnace, a method that produced steel of varying carbon content. The smith's first act of genius was to break this steel into pieces, then carefully stack and forge weld them together, folding the billet upon itself again and again, sometimes over a dozen times. This painstaking process did two things. It evenly distributed the carbon to eliminate weak spots, and it created the foundational grain structure for the blade, the hada, which would later resemble the texture of flowing wood grain. But the true heart of the katana's magic was the differential heat treatment. The smith would carefully paint the blade with a special clay slurry, applying a thinner layer along the razor-sharp edge and a thicker layer along the back and sides. When the blade was quenched in water, the thinly coated edge cooled instantly, transforming into an incredibly hard, brittle form of steel called martensite. The thicker clay insulation allowed the spine to cool more slowly, leaving it softer, tougher, and more flexible. This created the katana's iconic curvature and its legendary combination of a lethally sharp edge married to a shock-absorbing body, a physical manifestation of the philosophical balance between hardness and resilience. The result of this spiritual and technical dedication was the visible proof of perfection, the hamon. This was the beautiful, misty, white pattern line that dances along the edge of the blade, a direct physical record of the differential hardening process. No two hamon are ever exactly alike, making each katana a unique work of art and a permanent testament to the smith's skill on the day it was quenched. This eastern path of metal mastery, from China's industrial-scale foundries to Japan's spiritual forges, demonstrates how deeply culture and philosophy are forged into the very metal itself, creating technologies and aesthetics that were uniquely and brilliantly their own. For all the power of mass-produced cast iron, the material still had a critical and often fatal flaw: brittleness. A cast iron cannon could unleash devastating force, but it could also just as easily explode under the immense pressure of its own gunpowder, scattering shrapnel through its own crew. The true revolution, the one that would reshape the very fabric of society, was not about making more metal, but about making better metal. This was the centuries-long quest for consistent, high-quality steel, a material that combined the best properties of its predecessors, the hardness of cast iron and the malleability of wrought iron. The secret to this alchemical transformation lay in a seemingly insignificant element: carbon. The fundamental difference between these three foundational metals comes down to this one atom. Wrought iron is nearly pure elemental iron, containing less than 0.1% carbon. This makes it incredibly malleable and tough. You can bend it, twist it, and weld it with relative ease, but it cannot be hardened to hold a sharp edge. It's the ideal material for gates, nails, and horseshoes, but a terrible one for blades. Cast iron, on the other end of the spectrum, is flooded with carbon, containing between 2 and 4%. This high carbon content dramatically lowers the metal's melting point, allowing it to be cast into intricate shapes, but it also makes the material as brittle as glass. Strike it with a hammer and it will shatter. Steel is the perfect, elusive middle ground, an alloy of iron and carbon typically between 0.2 and 2%. This precise balance allows it to be hardened through heating and rapid quenching, creating a material that is both incredibly hard and shockingly resilient. Mastering the control of carbon content was the holy grail of metallurgy, a puzzle solved in different ways across the globe. Some of the earliest and most advanced solutions emerged in southern India and Sri Lanka around 300 before the Common Era. Here, master smiths developed a revolutionary method for creating what became known as Wootz steel. The process began by placing small pieces of wrought iron and specific carbon-rich leaves and wood into a sealed clay crucible. This sealed pot was then placed in a charcoal furnace and heated for hours, sometimes days. In this closed, controlled environment, the iron wouldn't burn. Instead, it absorbed carbon from the organic material, liquefying into a cake of super high-carbon crucible steel. When the crucible was cracked open and the ingot removed, it possessed a unique internal crystalline structure. When a skilled smith forged this ingot into a blade, carefully manipulating it with precise hammer blows, these crystals were drawn out into visible layers, creating the legendary, swirling Damascus patterns that were not just beautiful, but a signature of a superior, homogeneous steel. This was a material of myth and reality, traded across the ancient world and highly prized for swords that were said to be able to cut a silk scarf floating in the air. For over a millennium, the production of such high-quality steel remained a small-scale, almost mystical art. The industrial leap that would bring this miracle metal to the masses began in the 19th century, born from the frustration of an English inventor named Henry Bessemer. He was seeking a better way to produce cannon barrels for the British military, and was vexed by the inconsistent quality and high cost of wrought iron. His brilliant, fiery insight was to reverse the traditional process. Instead of starting with wrought iron and trying to add carbon to make steel, he would start with abundant, cheap, high-carbon pig iron from a blast furnace and find a way to remove the excess carbon. The Bessemer process was a spectacle of industrial might. Molten pig iron was poured into a massive, egg-shaped container called a converter. Then, a tremendous blast of air was forced through nozzles in the bottom of the vessel. As the air shot through the molten metal, it oxidized the impurities. The carbon burned away first, shooting a 30-foot plume of dazzling flame from the mouth of the converter. The silicon and manganese followed, adding their own brilliant colors to the inferno. The entire conversion from brittle pig iron to malleable steel took less than 20 minutes, a process that previously would have taken days of laborious fining by teams of smiths. By carefully watching the color and duration of the flame, an experienced operator could stop the blast at the precise moment the desired carbon content was achieved. This invention slashed the cost of steel production by over 80%, flooding the market with an affordable, consistent material that would become the literal skeleton of the modern world, enabling everything from skyscrapers and railroads to the precise machinery of the Second Industrial Revolution. This new abundance of reliable steel had its most immediate and devastating impact on the battlefield. For centuries, the quality of an army's weapons could vary wildly from regiment to regiment, even from soldier to soldier. The Bessemer process and its successors changed warfare into a contest of industrial output. Factories could now produce millions of identical, high-quality rifle barrels that could withstand the higher pressures of modern ammunition. They could forge artillery shells that exploded with predictable force and mass-produce the complex, hardened steel mechanisms of rapid-fire machine guns and battleship turrets. The side that controlled the most advanced steel mills could simply outproduce and out-equip its enemies, drowning them in a torrent of superior firepower. The individual skill of the blacksmith was rendered obsolete by the relentless, impersonal output of the converter, marking the final, definitive moment when the ancient art of the forge was eclipsed by the age of industrial science, its power now channeled into the engines of global conflict and monumental construction. Yet even as the age of steel reached its industrial zenith, seemingly rendering the individual smith obsolete, something remarkable began to happen. In the late 20th century, as the world became increasingly digital and mass-produced, a powerful counter-movement began to stir. A deep, almost primal longing for authenticity, for tangible connection, and for the evidence of the human hand sparked an unexpected and vibrant revival of the blacksmith's art. This wasn't an attempt to rewind the clock, but a dynamic fusion of past and future, where the ancient heartbeat of the hammer on anvil found a powerful new rhythm in the 21st century. This modern renaissance is fueled by a diverse coalition of enthusiasts, artists, and pragmatists. At one end of the spectrum are the historical reenactment communities, the living history buffs who became the unsung guardians of nearly lost knowledge. Groups dedicated to the Viking Age, the medieval period, and the American frontier took their passion beyond costuming and into the practical skills of daily life. They didn't just want to look the part, they wanted to live it, even if only for a weekend. This necessity drove them to seek out old texts, study museum pieces, and, most importantly, fire up forges. Through trial, error, and dedicated research, they began to reverse engineer techniques that had faded from common practice. They learned to build traditional clay-lined bloomery furnaces to smelt iron from ore, to hand-forge nails using the precise hammer strokes of an 18th century smith, and to create historically accurate armor, tools, and weapons. These communities, often operating on a non-profit, educational basis, became vital reservoirs of practical knowledge, preserving the how of the craft with an academic rigor that ensured these skills would not vanish from human memory. Simultaneously, a parallel movement was growing among artists and artisans disillusioned with the sterile perfection of factory-made goods. The artisan blacksmith movement champions the unique, the imperfect, and the soulful. It is a philosophy that values the story behind an object, the slight hammer marks on a custom-forged chef's knife that tell you it was shaped by a person, not a stamping press, or the organic, flowing form of a wrought iron gate that could never be duplicated exactly. This shift is part of a broader cultural desire to know the origin of the things we live with, to support local craftspeople, and to own objects with a narrative. The modern artisan smith is as much a designer and small business owner as a craftsperson, often using platforms like Instagram and Etsy to connect directly with a global clientele that values their work. They aren't just making things, they are selling a piece of heritage, a connection to a slower, more deliberate way of creating. Crucially, these modern smiths are not Luddites rejecting technology. They are savvy integrators, blending a profound respect for traditional methods with the best tools of the modern era. Walk into a contemporary blacksmith studio, and you might see a scene that would baffle a time-traveling medieval smith. The coal-fired forge still glows hot, but next to it stands an array of technological aids. A power hammer, a modern descendant of the water-powered trip hammer, sits ready to deliver hundreds of pounds of force with a tap of the foot pedal, saving the smith's body from the brutal strain of drawing out large billets of steel. A plasma cutter can swiftly slice through inch-thick plate metal with the precision of a laser, creating intricate shapes that would have taken days of drilling and chiseling. Even something as simple as a digitally controlled heat-treating oven allows for incredible precision when tempering a blade, ensuring a perfect, repeatable hardness that was once a matter of intuition and guesswork based on the color of the steel. The modern smith might use a traditional hand-forging technique to shape the curve of a leaf on a sculpture, then use an MIG welder to attach it securely to a base, choosing the right tool for each specific task without any dogmatic purity. This isn't cheating, it's evolution, allowing artists to realize visions of complexity and scale that were previously impossible. Yet, for all the knowledge we've painstakingly recovered, the world of ancient metalworking remains shrouded in tantalizing mysteries, its deepest secrets still guarded by time. There are legendary materials, whispered about in historical texts and evidenced by a handful of surviving artifacts, that modern science has simply not been able to fully replicate. These aren't just old recipes, they are puzzles that challenge our very understanding of ancient technological prowess. Perhaps the most famous of these enigmas is the legendary Damascus steel, famed for its beautiful, watery surface patterns and a reputation for being able to slice through a rifle barrel or a floating silk scarf with equal ease. We know the source was a high-carbon steel ingot from India known as woots, but the exact alchemy of its production, the specific ores, the precise thermal cycling during forging, and the secret ingredients added to the crucible created a nanoscale structure of carbon nanotubes and carbide bands that gave the blades their unparalleled properties. Despite decades of analysis and countless attempts by master bladesmiths, no one has ever perfectly duplicated the exact microstructure and performance of the finest ancient examples. The secret didn't just get lost, it vanished, leaving behind a standard of perfection that continues to haunt and inspire metallurgists today. Equally perplexing are the strange and wonderful artifacts that seem to defy the established timeline of technology. Take the Iron Pillar of Delhi, for instance. This 23-foot-tall column of wrought iron, weighing over 6 tons, was erected around the year 400 CE. The truly astonishing thing isn't its size, but its composition. It has stood exposed to the elements for over 1,600 years without rusting. Modern analysis shows it possesses an unusually high phosphorus content, which, combined with the dry climate and the pillar's own massive thermal mass, has created a thin, protective passive layer that shields it from corrosion. But was this a deliberate, calculated anti-corrosion treatment mastered by ancient Indian metallurgists? Or was it a happy accident resulting from their unique smelting process? We simply don't know. Then there are the Celtic and Merovingian pattern welded swords, composites of hundreds of carefully forged welded iron and steel rods, twisted and manipulated into blades of stunning strength and beauty. The knowledge required to consistently produce these functional masterpieces without modern temperature, controls, or welding techniques is staggering. Each of these objects stands as a silent, mocking rebuke to any assumption that ancient technology was primitive or simple. This drive to understand has given rise to a fascinating field known as experimental archaeology, where historians and craftsmen literally get their hands dirty trying to reverse engineer the past. These researchers build painstakingly accurate reconstructions of ancient furnaces using period-appropriate materials, digging clay from local riverbanks, making charcoal in traditional kilns, and smelting ore collected from historical mining sites. The process is grueling, unpredictable, and often ends in failure. But when it works, the results can be revolutionary, forcing us to completely rethink our assumptions. A team attempting to smelt iron in a reconstructed Norse furnace might discover that achieving the necessary temperature requires a specific, rhythmic bellows technique passed down through oral tradition, a nuance never mentioned in historical text. Another group, trying to recreate the bronze casting of a Shang dynasty ritual vessel, might find that the intricate decorations could only be achieved by preheating the ceramic molds to an exact temperature, a detail lost for millennia. Sometimes, these experiments yield shocking successes that rewrite history. For years, scholars debated how Viking Age blacksmiths could produce such fine, strong weapons without the consistent high-carbon steel we have today. It was assumed they simply made do with inferior materials. Then, experimental smiths like Dr. Andrea Carroll and others began rigorously testing the process of intentional carburization, soaking wrought iron in a carbon-rich environment inside the forge to transform its surface into steel. By meticulously controlling the fire and using only materials available to the Vikings, they were able to create steel that matched the quality found in archaeological samples. This proved that Viking smiths weren't just lucky. They were sophisticated materials scientists who understood and could manipulate the properties of metal on a fundamental level. Each firing of a reconstructed furnace, each hammer blow on a reconstructed anvil, isn't just a reenactment. It's a conversation with the past, a way of asking the ancients, how did you do it? And sometimes, if we listen closely to the ring of the hammer and the hiss of the quench, the past whispers back. From the first chance discovery of gleaming copper beads in a cooling campfire to the roaring, water-powered foundries of the industrial age, the story of blacksmithing is, in its deepest sense, the story of us. It is a narrative written in fire and metal, a 10,000-year saga of human curiosity, desperation, and breathtaking ingenuity. This craft represents one of our most fundamental relationships with the natural world, the act of taking the very bones of the earth and, through sheer force of will and intellect, reshaping them to our needs. It is a dialogue between humanity and the elements, a partnership with fire that has quite literally built the world we inhabit today. Every time you turn a key in a lock, every time you pick up a knife to prepare a meal, or every time you cross a bridge supported by steel beams, you are interacting with the latest chapter in this ancient story. These are not merely impersonal, mass-produced objects. They are the direct descendants of the first copper awl and the folded steel katana. They carry within them the echo of the hammer's ring and the residual heat of 1,000 forges. This legacy is all around us, hidden in plain sight, a testament to the countless unnamed smiths whose cumulative genius across millennia has gifted us this modern world. So the next time you hold a simple metal paperclip or admire the frame of a towering skyscraper, take a moment to see it not as a mere object, but as an endpoint in an incredible human journey. See the campfire where it all began, the divine mystery the Hittites saw in iron, the meticulous fold of a Japanese master's blade, and the fiery ambition of the Industrial Revolution. This craft is the eternal flame of human innovation, passed down from master to apprentice, from culture to culture, never extinguished, only transformed. We want to hear from you. Which part of this epic history resonated most deeply? Was it the spiritual power of the smith, the global chase for tin, or the sheer ingenuity of inventions like the blast furnace? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, thank you for joining us on this journey into the flames of the